And we are live.
Hi, everyone. Welcome, #EngageMOOC, to tonight's Hangout live with Mike Caulfield. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Natalie Delia Deckard, and I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Davidson College.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Stewart. I am at the University of Prince Edward Island in tiny East Coast Canada. And it's past my bedtime.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sundie Richard. I'm lead instructional designer at Davidson College, and I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina tonight, actually.
Hi, I'm Annie Sadler. I'm the Digital Learning Fellow at Davidson College, and I'm also in Charlotte tonight, actually not far from where Sundie is.
Hi, I'm Ariana. I'm a student at Davidson College. I work on instructional design projects at TechChange, and I'm a member of the EngageMOOC course team tonight.
And does that just leave me?
Yep, Mike.
Okay.
Special guest. Honored guest.
Yeah, I'm Mike Caulfield. I'm out in Vancouver, Washington, just outside Portland, Oregon. And I'm here to talk about media literacy.
Mike,
Oh, go ahead.
Mike, we're so excited to have you tonight. I was hoping that you could speak just in a few sentences and just to start us off to the piece that you contributed to the edX forum. Recognition is futile. Why checklist approaches to information literacy fail and what to do about it? Why do they fail and what can we do about it, Mike?
Okay. So the idea of the piece is that if you've been in media literacy in higher education or even in the K-12 space for any amount of time, you've seen some of these checklist approaches. I mean, some of them go, RADCAB is one of the early checklist approaches. CRAP, CRAAP is another one. There's a couple other models. But the idea of the checklist approach is that you get a article and you look through the article for certain attributes to see if the article resembles something that is more or less credible, right? So if you look at something like CRAP, you look for authority, you look for purpose. It's a kind of a rhetorical analysis of an article, similar to what you would do if you were if you were in a class on rhetoric, and saying, what is the purpose here? Who is behind this? What is their tone? What is their style? And for people that have a long period of time at their disposal, who have some familiarity with the person who is speaking or writing that article, who's behind the article, who already have a context. It's a useful approach, right? But for people that are flipping through a bunch of stuff that was fed to them through God knows what algorithm, and for whom they have no idea, where they have no idea of who might be behind the actual article or picture or photo, it's not always a productive approach. One of the things that we've learned going back into the history of the checklist approaches is that they were originally designed, and this is no joke, like in the 70s, in the 1970s, these approaches were designed to figure out what books would be suitable to add to your library, right? So, your patrons want a certain book, Healing with Crystals, because, it's the 1970s, or The Magical World of David Copperfield or something. And you've got to go and you've got to say, well, what's the authority here? What's the purpose? What's the coverage? And so these approaches actually got carried forward early in the web in 1996 or so. There's a famous article that applies some of these acquisition approaches to teaching students to evaluate resources on the web. And I'm not fully sure they even worked then, but they've worked less and less as time has gone on because, of course, we're presented with more and more information in these feeds with less and less context of where it came from. So what I actually propose, along with Sam Weinberg, who's a researcher that I draw a lot from and work with sometimes, is an approach that actually is much more investigative and relies on other people, right? That we don't have to act like we are the sole person who can decide if, I don't know, if, yournewswire.com is reliable or not. We don't have to go and do a full investigation of your Newswire if other people have already done that for us. And being that you're on the web, other people probably have, right? So you have to figure out how to utilize the web to look at these questions instead of acting, as I put it sometimes in presentations, instead of acting like this is a reading comprehension task on the SAT, where we can only look at the thing in front of us for clues, and then we're going to answer a series of multiple choice questions about whether it's credible or not.
I think that, these are a series of excellent points that you're making. I want to take 1 second just to invite another guest that we have in the chat with us in the live room to contribute questions and ask away. Matt, as you're so inclined, right? You're welcome to add your voice to the conversation. Mike, as I was reading this, I was really struck by the history of yellow journalism. I'm not sure if everyone remembers that term, but this idea that historically, this is not the first time that we as a society are grappling with fake news. It's just a relatively new name. I'm wondering what we can learn from that history and the ways that it's brought us into conflict before. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that. I know it's a bit out of left field, but I'm hoping to contextualize this historically.
Well, if you want to contextualize it historically, there's a great report out about 2 weeks ago from the Rand Corporation called Truth Decay, which actually does contextualize it historically. It looks at 3 different previous periods of America in which we found ourselves in a similar situation to this. One of them is yellow journalism, but 3 crises where the public trust, in institutions, etc., declined, and at the same time, there was a sort of a proliferation of material that we would consider low quality material or sensationalistic material, and the Rand report looks at that, and when it comes to the conclusion it comes to is that on 4 dimensions, if you look at 4 dimensions, and I forget the exact 4 dimensions, declining trust in institutions, prevalence of opinion treated as more important than fact, spin and these things. I'm blanking on the 3rd one, and then the 4th one is a general acceptance of fact and analysis as a foundation for debate. We've seen in various patterns throughout history, we've seen all of these things come into question in these multiple crises, except that last one. Actually, in the Rand report, it's the first one that they, the order of it is the first one. But except that piece that we've never actually been in a place like this where, I hate to say this, but it'll sound expansive, but where the idea of facts as something that you actually want to pursue and come to some level of agreement on has been so battered and so at risk. And it's a pretty extensive report. It's I don't know, just short of 100 pages, and they go in pretty deep. So there are historical models here, and I think it's important that we acknowledge them. The report also draws from those historical models to talk about how we got out of these crises before, like what was the result of these crises. And there's a positive, optimistic story that all of these crises led to new professional standards, right? Led to a rebuilding of public trust in one way or another, right? So it's not a story of endless decline. That we do have these crises, and we do have these moments where we come together again. But it is a different moment.
And part of that circle often ends up being a redefinition of the purpose of journalism and the shape of publics and all those pieces, right? Where we end up kind of redefining what it means. We have spent, because I found your conversation around the RADCAB and CRAB. I've been teaching media literacy for 20 years. And a lot of really what this MOOC came out of was initially a couple of years ago, right after the 2016 election, I sat down and went, like, I've been teaching media literacy for 20 years, and I don't feel like I have the tools to address this current time. I need all of you out there. I need a group conversation. And this is the sort of kind of marvelous manifestation that I've been lucky enough to have this. But we have this in, histories of peer review and stuff too. Rosie Lefebvre was mentioning, I think in the chat, like we have the how to recognize a peer-reviewed article. Does it have ads? Is it written in academic prose? All of those pieces, all of those older pieces require a recognition of format, right? And that there is a legitimate format and a legitimate sort of way in which we present particular types of arguments that delineate who's speaking and who's included in that conversation. And one of the things that's happened over the last couple of years is when you have what you might call bad actors who are essentially mimicking the form of news, they're mimicking those conventions. They're able to read them. They've never been secret. We've just kind of assumed that certain groups publish this way and certain groups publish this way, and everyone has their conventions and their belonging within that. And what's happened is once you get people who are copying them, not for the purpose of belonging, but for the purpose of circulation, then you have to change the rules by which you judge those things.
Yeah, and there's two pieces to that. So one is the sort of purpose and coordination, right? It's not just purpose, but it's also the coordination of purpose, right? So it's not just one bad actor. There are people working in concert to do this. There's economic incentives to do this on a level that didn't really exist before, to mimic these surface features, so there's a explosion of counterfeiting because of that. But the second piece of it is it's much easier to counterfeit things than it would have been 20 years ago, and that's for all sorts of reasons. The explosion of WordPress and templates has been a great boon for anybody that wants to express themselves in a way that looks really professional. It also means that any organization can set up a website that looks credible in about 3 minutes, right? Because you pull up WordPress, you get a template, and you look as good as 90% of the things out there. Even little things like, it used to be you need someone to read your material to spell check it, right? We didn't have a spell checker, built in to Word in 1978 when some of these rules came about. Now everybody's got a spell checker. The fact that everything is punctuated correctly and spelled correctly is not really evidence that there's some sort of editorial oversight over the thing that you're looking at, and on and on and on. So one of the things that happens with the net is that the cost, not only of publishing, but of publishing and looking professional, comes down in terms of time. It comes down in terms of cost. But that also means that the cost of counterfeiting, right, of counterfeiting that expertise is also falling at this really precipitous rate. So
we've had a pretty pleasant Engage MOOC thus far. We haven't had a whole lot of arguments. We've actually had people in the edX chats who are going, well, but we have to have disagreement. And I believe that to have a healthy political polity, you need to have disagreement. We haven't had a ton of disagreement. So I'm going to bring forward the big Engage MOOC disagreement. I don't know if Matt Crossland was able to join us tonight. The Matt who's in our chat is not Matt Crossland, but Matt Crossland posted a response to your piece. And he said, A, that he finds the 4 moves a little bit like a checklist, even though you're talking about the sort of critique of checklist approaches, and B, that he's not sure it's going to help with polarization. Did you have a chance to take a look at that piece, and do you have a response? And Matt, can you come out?
Yeah. So yeah, I have a response. I think that it looked like Matt was taking the 4 moves from the blog post, which is great. I have a summary of the 4 moves in the blog post, but hadn't necessarily skimmed the Web Literacy for Fact Checkers, which I call a textbook, but it's about a 2-hour read, which shows how you apply those in practice. And so I'll say 2 things. One, they're not a checklist because it is actually a sequence of activities. One of the things you'll find with checklists is that they're not conditional at all, right? So if you look at RADCAB, or you look at CRAP, or you look at COCOA, or whatever you look at, what you'll find is the idea of the checklist is, does it have this? Yeah, it has this. Does it have this? Yeah, it has this. And if it does have thing number 1, you don't stop, right? You don't say, oh, well, it has coverage, so let's stop. No, you go through the whole thing, and it's one of the things that makes these checklists really time-consuming. Is there's no given thing that's sort of the end of the question for you. You've got to go through the whole checklist for every single thing, no matter what shows up at the top of the checklist. You've got to run it all the way to the bottom, right? We look through a sequence. So I had a title in there that mentioned fast and frugal trees, I think, or fast and frugal something. But if you look up the research on fast and frugal trees and expert decision-making using fast and frugal trees, they actually go into pretty deep detail on the difference between expertise that goes through a decision tree sort of process and expertise that relies on these sort of representativist heuristics, right? So that's the other way you can do it. You can say, does this thing look like this other thing? Let me look at all these attributes. The second thing I think that Matt mentioned is, well, okay, so now you get to this other thing. You get to this what? You get to your Newswire, right? Which is a known purveyor of fake news, right? Run by 2 Russians, actually, right? So you get to your Newswire, and you find out your Newswire is considered by Wikipedia or whatever to be a conspiracy hoax site run by these 2 Russians. Well, what if you like that, right? And I think the answer to that is, I don't care about the people that like that. I mean, that's not my concern, right? We see the people on the extremes in the polls, and even in the gun debate, this horrible David Brooks column talking about, I think, a nice group of people that do some of this deliberative dialogue stuff. But there was a David Brooks column, like, we got to sit down, like the guy that thinks that, we should have a gun buyback program with the guy that thinks that, everybody should be, able to own bazookas, right? And find some middle ground. And that's stupid. I mean, that's just asinine. The truth is that what happens with people generally, at least in my experience, in what I've read about the way things like radicalization happens, is that people start actually from a relatively reasonable center. They encounter materials that are intriguing for various reasons, that hit the right notes for them, and then they start to immerse themselves in those materials. Now, by the time they actually realize that these are fake, or that these are heavily manipulative, or that these are financed by people who don't necessarily have their best interests at heart, they're already far down that road, right? And the idea is not, once they're down that road, can we pull them back? Because I'm not certain we can. The idea is for the massive amount of people who joined Facebook just because they wanted to share baby photos, can we help those people from starting to go down that road? Can we stop that? And especially when we're looking at our students who are really at the beginning of forming political opinions and at the beginning of thinking about who they want to give their trust to, right? can we stop them from going down that road? So I don't, you know, if people look through it and they say, you know, they find out, hey, this turns out to be an SPLC labeled hate site, but I kind of like it. I'm sorry. That's just not the problem we're trying to solve here, and it's not the problem that most people have. If that makes sense.
It does.
Okay.
You absolutely, but I'm still somewhat, I don't want to say hung up because it has a negative connotation, but hung up on what you were saying earlier about the ways in which WordPress themes, right, which sounds really mundane, but everything has this sheen of professionalism. So it's hard to even just visually separate what is professional from what is amateur and use that as a proxy for what is legitimate versus what is illegitimate. Jim Luke brings up the point that if these things are no longer usable, right, useful, then, I mean, this question begs, right, what does become useful just as an easy heuristic? And Rosie, one of our contributors and participants, wanted help and wanted to make it explicit how we distinguish peer-reviewed articles from non-peer-reviewed articles. I'm wondering if we can bring the process of peer review into the conversation about fake and real and professionalism and not professionalism.
So remind me, the Jim Luke question was, what was the Jim Luke question?
Jim Luke says, we need to change our rule of thumb heuristics for evaluating truthfulness of sources. It's more of a comment that I think...
So we have a few things, right? I mean, one of the things that you can look at, and one of the things that we look at in web literacy for fact checkers, is there are what we consider to be surface features. These are features which are easily modifiable, right, by the user, by the speaker, by the addresser in your little speech diagram. These things are surface features, and they're no good, right? I mean, so telling students, hey, look for the style. Hey, look to see if is there email address? Does this appear to come from some sort of physical location? I mean, these are things that may have had a place in 1998. They don't have a place anymore. But there are, outside of surface features, there are what we consider deep features, and they're usually network features, right? So, for example, it's much harder to fake a history. Right, so something spins up and it's the Baltimore Gazette, right? Baltimore Gazette, serving Baltimore since 1859, right? Okay, great. Anybody can put that up and make it look like paper that's been serving Baltimore since 1859. Now, if you go to archive.org and you type in Baltimore Gazette, and it turns out Baltimore Gazette the first time Baltimore Gazette was ever crawled is 3 weeks ago. Well, then Baltimore Gazette probably has. I mean, that's not fakeable because it relies on these extrinsic signals that aren't really manipulatable by the addresser, right? By the person actually writing the piece. I see some other questions popping up, and I missed one. But again, what we really heavily rely on, peer review. So peer review is also a great example where we can use these extrinsic features, these deep features, cross-referencing and citations. Right, we consider these to be deep features because they're not easily constructed on the surface of a document. I can't really control, 10 years of citation on an article. I mean, I could, I suppose, but it'd be a pretty long game if I wanted to fool somebody into clicking on something. I'd probably go about it differently. So we show students how to use Google Scholar, and we make sure the students understand this isn't a competition, right? The thing that gets 43 sites is not 4 times better than the things that gets 10 sites versus the thing that gets 300 sites. But what we say is that if someone claims to have academic expertise, right, many types of expertise, but if they claim to have academic expertise in a subject, that we'd hope to see a publication record, and ideally even having 1 or 2 citations on that publication record, even having a small number of citations shows hey, someone else that probably knows more than me looked at this and thought it was worth referencing in whatever it was that they were doing. Is it foolproof? No, it's not foolproof, but it's certainly better than my own impression, right? I mean, whoever's citing it out there from a different journal probably has more knowledge than me, and I've got to take that into consideration. And that brings up one other piece I think that's really important for this. Part of this is humility as well, right? We do get into this idea that we're all, I don't know, we're all living in some sort of Da Vinci Code world, and we're going to be Tom Hanks and get to the bottom of this thing. And, in reality, the best route for most of these things is to find someone smarter than you that looked at it, whether that's Snopes or a researcher or peer review, right? That it's gone through a process of peer review and made it into a journal.
So I think a question that we see coming up in the YouTube chat in a lot of different iterations is this idea of whether we're supposed to use the 4 moves as an alternative to the process of having a set of heuristics for identifying legitimate sources, or are we still in conjunction working towards the accreditation of legitimate sources in the digital age, and this is just like a complementary piece alongside of that?
Yeah, so the issues of credibility don't go away, and I think Matt actually mentioned that in his article. I mean, eventually, the way I talk about trust with students and the way faculty is trust is a currency that you have to spend somewhere, right? And a big piece of what you're going to do over the course of a class is figure out, who values your trust and who you should trust with your trust. And so so that those issues of credibility, et cetera, don't go away. The checklist approach doesn't, to me, seem to be the best way of doing it. If you walked into a class on paleontology, and I said as the instructor, you said to me, hey, what are some of the top journals in paleontology that I should be looking at to see what the current work is in this area? And I said to you, hey, here's RadCap, go at it, figure it out. I mean, you think I was a pretty crappy? You think I was a not so good instructor? I mean, what you'd say is, look, I'm here because right? I'm here because because you've spent your life in this area. Tell me which journals I should be looking at, as a budding paleontologist. I think as a budding newsreader, I don't think we should shy away from doing the same thing. If we know that Snopes is one of the fastest way to get a quick answer on something, then then we should tell students, check Snopes first, TM, because honestly, if they check Snopes first, they'll get to the answer. Now, like just as with the professor, you can't say that and not have reasons behind it, right? I mean, you have to be able to explicate the reasons why you say this journal and not that journal. And you want the students to develop, I think, a healthy understanding of why they might be directed initially to this thing or that thing, so that they can make some of their own decisions over time in what to trust. We actually have something, I wouldn't call it a checklist, but if you want to call it a checklist, you might. In Web Literacy for Fact Checkers, we have the 4 attributes of a good news source, and the 4 attributes we point out are the machinery of care. Does this source considerable resources, investigating stories, trying to get stories right, fact-checking stories? We have transparency. Does this source show who they are run by, show how they gathered the information? If they went and got a fact or confirmed a fact via a phone call, do they say in the article, on a phone call with so-and-so, this was verified? What would I say? The machinery of care, transparency, agenda, right? Does this have an agenda that is news-based, or does it have an agenda to say elect Democrats, which is a different sort of agenda? And finally, expertise, right? Do they actually pull in people that, if it's a journalistic thing, do they pull in people that have been trained in journalism and understand the ethics and process of journalism? And if they don't, do they have if they pull in people with different experience, do they have a process by which those people are inculcated with the standards of the standards and ethics of their profession? So those 4 things, but they're not meant to do on the fly, right? You're not meant to sit there and just like everything you hit, you're going to pull out these 4 attributes of a good news source. They're meant much more to, as you go through your process and you start to notice this news source and that news source, you start to you maybe start to add things to your personal white list of things you trust. And this is how fact checkers do it too, by the way. Fact checkers don't come to a source and evaluate each source on the fly. Fact checkers over time develop what they believe are the most reliable sources with the best oversight. And for any given question, when they do a search and they see one of those sources that they trust, I'll give you an example. The Atlantic used to, I don't know if this is still the case, but the Atlantic used to have one of the best fact-checking organizations in the business, right? Just absolutely rigorous with the fact-checking. So they see something in the Atlantic, they make a beeline to it because they know that's going to be good, right? And over time, you do build up this sort of personal whitelist. But you start it by being told, hey, here's some sites, Snopes, PolitiFact. Here's why the Washington Post is different from Breitbart. Let's talk about that.
So I kind of have
go ahead.
A question. So as a new member of Twitter, I've been on Twitter for 1 week.
Okay.
I'm thinking a lot about first-person accounts of what's happening and how first-person news accounts, I'm thinking of police shootings where someone is recording or speaking in to their phone about what's happening. Yeah. How do the 4 moves apply? Are the tools that have the potential to democratize the news and the way that we're receiving information, do they no longer have that potential if they have to be verified by the institutions that might be silencing them?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And one of the things that I thought a lot about in the moves was precisely that thing. I mean, I actually come from a blogging background where we were going to just upset the whole mainstream media apple cart, got I think a little ahead of our wheels on that one. But one of the things that we look, I mean, the second of the 2 moves is go to the source, right? And if you go to the source and you find somebody who you can verify is in a position to know, right? And so that's one of the things at the end of Web Literacy for Fact Checkers, we talk about what defines a fact. And a fact, for our purposes, is something generally agreed. Something that is generally agreed on by people in a position to know who can be counted on to tell the truth, right? So if you find a person in a position to know and you can verify that they're in a position to know, and you are able to ascertain that they're in line with the consensus of other people that are in a position to know, and that they don't have an outsized motivation to lie, you can accept that. I mean, it is certainly true that what you'd like to happen is one of the jobs of the media is, okay, well, so that person said that, we kind of have the raw intel. Hopefully somebody calls that person and verifies, hey, did you say this? Were you there? Was this actually you? And that's part of what you have to do in a society. Societies are based on trust. And we have got a little too much sometimes into this, this Da Vinci Code mythology that we're each going to, personally, dig deep into the things that nobody is telling us and somehow be brilliant at that.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely. And there are a number of really great questions coming out of the chat where.
Okay, sorry.
No,
talking too loud.
Not at all. But they're on the same lines, right? Okay. People are. Tudor Mentor Institute says, with so much flowing across your feed daily, how often are people really going to do this fact checking? Yes, we have this situation where we do think we're in the Da Vinci Code and we're going to go out and do this, but truthfully, are people really doing it, or are we relying on these kind of trusted sources, the media pieces? Other people are asking. At the same time, there's this move away from trusting experts, where the academic elite gets framed as such and out of tune with sort of Joe Sixpack versions of identity or society. So how do we deal with trust in a time when We know we're polarized. We know that most people really are not going to necessarily dig down while on their phone in walking through the city, and don't necessarily trust the sources that have been traditionally trusted. So what do we do with trust right now?
Okay, so for the first question, will people actually do this? I found that people do. One of the reasons why I'm so insistent on a 90-second method, and people say I'm insane for insisting on 90-second fact checks, that I should back off of that statement. But I believe it's possible, and I've seen people over time learn to do it. Once it is to that level, it is hygiene. It's sort of like asking, how can we trust that people will wash their hands, after sneezing or something like that. I mean, well, you make the means of washing your hands readily available, and you set a culture where people, kind of ritualize this, right? And this just becomes a cultural expectation that you'll take the 90 seconds to do this. The expertise issue is harder. One thing I just want to make really clear, I actually think one of the most important things that we're trying to do in our media literacy project, in the Digital Polarization Initiative, more broadly, is rebuild trust. I think actually that's the core of what we're doing, because we cannot function in a society without trust. Trust is being eroded for very specific political reasons, which are very specifically tied to what I believe to be an authoritarian agenda, and that's not just about our current politics or whatever. That's broadly across the world. This is going on. We're not even patient zero here, right? And if we don't rebuild that trust, we're all doomed. My big worry is not that students will be gullible fools reading all these fake news stories. My big worry is that students will actually not read news at all, because what they'll come to believe is that it's all fake. It's all bullshit. It's all just the powerful, fighting over who gets to manipulate who. And when we get to that point, when trust is removed from the equation, all you have left really is trust and truth go by the wayside, and all you have left is power. And again, you can see this in Hannah Arendt's work. She talks extensively about this issue. But that's the end goal of a lot of this stuff. And so what we're trying to do is we are trying to get students, step one of the 4 moves is find previous work, right? Which just in really simple terms says find somebody that you trust that has done this before. And that's okay, and if you don't have somebody that you trust, start to figure out somebody that you can trust, right? And so trust is really central to this. And what we're trying to do is build trust. I could go on a whole thing about how the real target of disinformation is always trust and social cohesion. What we try to do in these classes is we try to rebuild that in a way that I hope elegantly splits the difference between sort of unquestioning acceptance of traditional authorities and plugging into I think a citizen's investigative urge. We have to find the balance there, but the balance can't be. One of the best articles I read, right after the election, was Dana Boyd's piece on the way in which our current media literacy creates this sort of hero narrative of we're all going to be the individual hero finding the truth that nobody has found before. You're just not that smart. I'm not that smart. You're not that smart. There's nobody watching it here that's that smart. Someone knows it better than you. And honestly, the best thing you can do is figure out who those people would be. Who's in a position to know? One thing we talk about on the source, forget about Richards. I don't know what that means.
Actually, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but we just got this, and they're all amazing questions, everyone. Okay. Thank you for watching. Jim Luke makes the point, and others have alluded to it, but he makes it quite explicitly. When we enact the these 4 points, aren't we at risk of reifying existing hierarchies in who is legitimate and who has reputation and who has expertise? And don't we risk marginalizing people who are traditionally marginalized, the same voices that are always silenced?
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely a risk. If you look through, you can look on 4 Moves and you can see that one of the ways we deal with that, we don't just teach 90-second fact checks, right? The entire model of what we do in the classroom, really 3 parts. The first part is the actual investigation, the fact check. The second part is looking at structural issues, right? So, you know, for example, give you one example. We have a photo that's supposedly a picture a mayor's aide took and posted on Facebook. The New York mayor's aide posted on Facebook. His sister's there holding a sign that says "fuck whiteness," right? And so is this real or not? So the first thing that we do is we look at that and we have the students do reverse image search and we go through and find out if this is real. Now, I will tell you that the students are actually much more empowered by that, right? And much more able to sort truth from fiction, you know, than anything I think that they're traditionally getting, right? They're already in an investigative process. But the second step is talking about the structural issues and the social impact, right? So it turns out in that case, the photo is true. Like, this is really the mayor's aide's sister holding the sign, says "fuck whiteness." And so the second question is, okay, well, you know, why is that being spread? What is the architecture of outrage that propagates this? There's the question comes up, you know, what do words mean in different environments, and how does pushing a term like whiteness, which is really talking about, you know, some structures of social oppression, how does that read when it's pushed outside of that to the people that are reading Breitbart, right? And how does that create this outrage, and how is that outrage used, right? And so we talk about the larger structural issues, and then we talk about the interventions, and the interventions are both, you know, how do you intervene when you see something that's wrong, or you see people sharing this in a way that maybe does not understand it, and it just shows they don't understand it. But it's also social interventions too, like what are the ways in which the economic incentives, you know, kind of meld with racism in this country that produce this outrage factory on the right. We also do stuff where one of the examples, you look at the arsonist birds sequence and you'll see it again, where you follow a story that says that there's these birds that are, you know, burning up, you know, lighting these fires to feast on lizards. You know, all this sounds crazy as I talk about it. But you trace that back to a journal article and you realize actually the real point of that journal article was that scientists had not respected the knowledge of indigenous communities, which had said for years that this was happening, and scientists treated that as folklore instead of fact, right? So you have a discussion about that. What I will tell you is, I mean, so people often say, well, aren't we going to reify this? I tell you, if you get a student in your classroom who has no background in this at all, and you tell them, look, you know, the structures and architecture of power makes it so whatever you read, you know, has some sort of critical bias or agenda that you don't realize, and is suppressing, you know, the student isn't going to hear anything past the first part of that sentence, right? The students always economize lessons, take the smallest possible lesson away from anything you tell them, and the lesson the student will say is everything's bullshit, right? Later on, as students become and they start to get the skills and they start to understand what the structures of power are, yeah, I mean, absolutely, you've got to go in and you've got to, and that's what we do in our model, right? You've got to start to talk to students about some of the assumptions and some of the ways in which those structures of power protect themselves. But if that's your starting bid, I mean, God help us, because what the students will walk away with is this idea that they've just solved their media literacy problem. Everything's bullshit, you know, everything gets an X, and they don't got to worry about it, and they do. And again, I think the Dana Boyd piece and some of her work since then has shown that this is what happens.
Okay, I want to touch on that understanding piece, because I love the fact that the DigiPo initiative and your book and the 4 Moves project are all these really positive, here is a path to things that you can do, right? My concern is also that people just kind of give up and go, oh, well, it's all fake news, so none of it matters. I can't do anything. And I think once we give over to that, I can't do anything, we have definitely a problem. At the same time, we have just finished talking a lot about sort of the structure of the internet. And that idea of understanding has some real limits that I don't think we've fully butted up against the edges of yet. And part of that is around how much is hidden from us, right? So we live in this, and the term that someone named Jonathan Albright used on Twitter was the data industrial complex, where we have closed tech platforms and freemium services and proprietary algorithms, almost none of which are visible to us. And literally half of my social and professional interactions, if not more, take place within these black boxes that I can't open and see within. So how do you reckon understanding with the things that we can't see? Right?
Yeah.
How do you enter that data, and how do you contextualize this or nest this in the data industrial complex?
Yeah. So I'm sympathetic to that viewpoint, but what I will say that we haven't done anything with what we know and can teach students. I'll give you an example. Every week I see on Twitter someone talk about the opaque process behind Google search results, and that was true. That was true in like 2009, but since 2013. Google has openly published what they call their raters guide for the thousands of search raters they have around the world who produce the scores, which then show what comes to the top. And you can actually show people what those documents are, how those Google ratings and how that search guidance over time, how when it's changed, it's resulted in different impacts, right? And think about what some of the hidden assumptions, right, of that are. Yet I will guarantee you that I'll guarantee you that most people that can hear my voice have never actually opened that document, right? We see a similar thing in news, right? News does have to be more transparent about what it does, but we actually already know a bunch about how journalism works, and our students don't know any of it. So it's not really surprising that students don't understand that Gateway Pundit is not a journalist if they don't understand what journalists do. We spend a lot of time actually teaching students what scientists do, right? I mean, y'all went through, 4th and 5th grade, and we all learned about the scientific method and, forming a hypothesis and so forth. Most of the information students get won't come to them via journal articles. I know this will shock people on this, but most of the information they get will not come to them via journal articles, come to them via reporters, and yet, there's no equivalent to that training in what is the scientific process for what is the journalistic process, and what does journalism look like, and what are the ethics of journalism, and what do we, when we talk about verifying sources, what does that mean? What is on the record? What is on background? The craft of journalism. So we don't talk about that. So there's a lot of stuff out there we do nothing with, and I believe that in order for us to rebuild trust, right, we are going to, one thing that's going to happen is Facebook is one of the worst offenders, right? We're going to have to crack open what the processes are in these things that affect our lives and affect what news comes to us. That has to happen, and Godspeed if you're on that battle. But for us as educators, like I'm absolutely flabbergasted that we have all this information out. We're begging, like, give us more information about how this happens, we have a pile of information sitting on our desk that we haven't even given to students. And that makes no sense to me at all.
Probably because a lot of it's intimidating as well. I want to ask quickly about, okay, the Twitter lockout, right? Suddenly in the last 24 hours, a lot of the bots are being purged. There is a great cry on one particular side of the political spectrum. Oh my God, I've lost 1,000 followers. I personally, I checked, I have not lost any. So I guess I was not a big Russian follow. I'm not really surprised. I want to think about that. I want to ask you about the Twitter lockout, particularly in the context of thinking about participatory engagement, right? We're talking about navigating participatory engagement, ways to connect with other humans, and you really can't have participatory engagement with a bot. So does this help? Is this good?
Yeah, Twitter should have done this. Really, Twitter should have done this during Gamergate, frankly. And it's really depressing that it's taken this long, because of course what's happened is, in the meantime, people have been allowed to grow up in really this sort of hall of mirrors that this environment creates, and so now it's being taken away after we've let it metastasize for years, and the shock is great, and the trust, and now people, when they see the difference, what differences happen, are going to be very suspicious of that. If they had done this back in 2013, when people initially started saying, "Hey, we got some real problems here," we could have avoided an awful. I don't want to overstate it, but I think more than most people realize we could have avoided this problem of the industrialization of conversation is at the heart of our problem with the public square, and one of the mechanisms for that, I have bots I love. I love many bots, but bots are at the heart of this problem of the industrialization of conversation, and you can't. It'll be really interesting over the next few days. I'm going to watch the trending topics and see how they shift. And I think what we'll find is that we've been existing in a world that, even for us, right, is an illusion. Largely a Potemkin village, right? Because we've allowed people to have as many votes as they have the mechanics to supply bots. And so I hope this continues. It is one example of why we need. Part of that structure we use is really the investigation, structural issues and social impact, and then interventions, right? And the interventions part is both personal intervention, like what can I do to make this situation better, but it's also policy intervention. It's people thinking about, what should platforms do? What should the public do? What should we do politically? If we had these discussions earlier with a broad variety of people, the public, our students, citizens, and really explain to them what was going on with bots in a way that they really understood before they got sort of hooked on this illusory world. This would be a lot easier. What's going to happen now, of course, is we're in this catch-22, because it's going to erode trust. What's going to happen is people are going to see all their counts go down. They're going to see the trending topics change to topics that are not their core topics, and they're going to believe that this is all part of a big conspiracy. This goes back to this idea of, are we trying to get the people that believe that the white supremacist site or the Southern Poverty Law Center labeled hate site or your Newswire is a good source? Are we trying to get them back? And the answer is no, right? That's not something that's really possible or probable. It's much better to have early interventions where we prevent people from going down this road. We prevent them from falling into this hall of mirrors.
I love this point that you made where you bring it back to how there need to be specific policies around these things. And I think that that's also a point that came up during our last hangout with Chris. And I think that what I'm wondering specifically is if there are any specific policies or movements that you think that our audience should be aware of and we should be aware of around digital platforms and how they're being regulated.
Yeah, so I mean, you had a session with Zeynep this morning, right? And I think that's the most interesting. What she's working with and talking about is the most interesting piece to me. We have to look at the ways in which people are systemically suppressing, the authentic voices of citizens through these industrialized methods, through these coordinated trolling methods, through all these methods that people have to drown out the authentic voice, right? Our old model is one of speech is about the possibility of speaking, the possibility of printing something. Now everybody can print something, everyone can say something, but the chance of it getting heard becomes really low when you have all these coordinated efforts to block that out. I think that's the most interesting policy piece for it, and that means we have to, instead of talking about ridiculous free speech issues of James Damore or whatever, we've got to start looking and saying, how do when we see the organized harassment of female reporters online, right? We've got to look at issues like that and say, how is that changing the information landscape? Black academics, Black female academics, how is that changing what opinions get heard, right? When it costs so much for an individual to try to navigate this world of bots and trolls and so forth. And that has to be our focus. And we have to start realizing that that's the free speech that is suppressed. I actually think one of the ways to think about this, this is probably really reckless of me, so I'll say something really reckless in the last 3 minutes, because that's how I roll. We have these RICO laws in the U.S., right, which are against racketeering, and what this is a way. One of the problems when you went after the mafia was that it was a system, but there wasn't really a direct causality, right? Some person says that this is a problem, that person disappears. Some person says, hey, a shame if something happened to your business. All these direct causalities where someone directly says something to someone and you can trace that chain down, don't exist. And that's kind of where we are with this stuff, right? Someone finds a academic of color that they don't like, retweets something that they said with a little snarky thing, knowing that they're followed by 10,000 angry Breitbarters.
Takes it out of context.
Takes it out of context, and now suddenly that person, the cost of that person's speech is just it's just unbearably high. And yet, what did that person say? Go and give death threats to this person? Call the SWAT team? Have people post their address? No, nobody said anything. It's all deniable, right? We faced this before with other policy issues. I mean, the mafia was one. It was a network which was hard to crack into because there was not the sort of direct coordination that we were not used to dealing with. We've got to start to think about these things as systems. We've got to start to deal with them as systems. And ideally, while policy tries to figure out the best way to do that without taking away people's rights, the platforms have to step up in the meantime and reconsider what is really an outdated view of what speech is and what the public square is.
Mike, I really want to thank you on behalf of the entire team and on behalf of everybody that's participating in Engage MOOC for your time tonight and for your expertise on these issues. I'm really going to leave this conversation thinking about what are the structural mechanisms that we can put in place to empower academics of color, to empower marginalized voices that have titles that don't protect them in a way that they systemically need to be protected in order to flourish in the current public discourse and in online spaces. George Station asks a question that I think is really important, but I know that we won't have time to answer. So I'm just going to put it out there as a question to the whole group. What are the institutional policies for public academics that can help or hurt discourse? I want to amplify that question. What are the social policies and the legislative policies that can work to help or hurt discourse, coming from everyone and from each of us? Thank you for your time.
Put that out on Twitter, and actually that's one of the things we're going to take on in topic 4 as well, so it's a perfect segue. Thanks so much. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.